In the spring of 1891, the plains of Nebraska thawed slowly, as if the land itself resisted change. Wind swept across the open fields and pressed against the weathered boards of Elias Gray's house. He lived alone on the parcel his father had claimed decades earlier. The house was modest, the barn aging, and the fields narrow and stubborn. To Elias, the land was not wealth, but proof of endurance. Every fence post and furrow testified that he had remained when others had left, standing firm against the relentless winds and harsh seasons. His days were long, measured by work that yielded little recognition but constant satisfaction, the kind that grew quietly in the marrow of one's bones. Margaret Rowland arrived in town with little more than a wagon and a name people already questioned. She was older than Elias by several years, and her presence carried a steady, restrained strength. Rumors followed her as closely as her shadow. Some whispered that her husband had died under circumstances they could not explain. Others spoke of a court hearing in another county that had ended ambiguously. No documents were produced, yet suspicion lingered. She carried herself with composure, unyielding to gossip, moving through the town with careful precision. Her eyes, sharp and attentive, suggested intelligence and experience that few dared to challenge. Margaret found work at the postal station, sorting letters and registering parcels. Elias saw her whenever he came to collect his mail. Their exchanges were brief and measured, each word intentional. She handled each envelope as though it contained fragile truth, every action deliberate. What unsettled him was not the rumors, but her unshakable composure. She neither defended herself nor sought sympathy. She simply existed on her own terms, and that quiet confidence unsettled even the most casual observer. Soon, Sheriff Caleb Hardin began appearing more often in town. He entered the postal station with polite persistence, always watching Margaret with careful, patient scrutiny. His questions were subtle, designed to probe without accusation, yet his attention never wavered. Anonymous letters arrived soon after, one addressed to Margaret, warning that the truth would surface regardless of her wishes. Days later, Elias received one, suggesting that anyone sheltering her would share in her guilt. No signature accompanied the notes, only smudges and impressions left by careless hands. The town's whispers grew sharper, tension threading the streets like invisible barbed wire. The choice settled heavily on Elias. The law in that region tolerated little ambiguity. If he stood beside Margaret, he risked everything he had built. If he distanced himself, suspicion might fade, yet the cost would be personal, an unspoken guilt that would linger. He spent nights awake, listening to the wind press against the house, weighing duty against conscience, safety against the pull of his growing regard for her. The weight of indecision became as pressing as the wind itself, pressing him into choices that would shape both their lives. The letters continued through early summer, arriving without pattern, yet always carrying the same quiet menace. Margaret moved through her work with precision, never betraying the anxiety she might have felt. Elias watched her from a distance, noticing the small details, the way she paused over each envelope, the slight crease of her brow, the careful way she aligned parcels on the counter. Their encounters remained brief, yet charged with unspoken tension. Elias understood that trust had become fragile, easily fractured, yet necessary. Sheriff Hardin's visits increased. He arrived with casual politeness, his questions designed to unsettle without overtly threatening. He inquired about Margaret's past, about who spoke with her, about her movements in the county. His scrutiny spread beyond her, touching Elias as well. Rumors gathered momentum, whispers threading the town with subtle accusation. Isolation became Margaret's companion, but she bore it with a steady resolve. Elias, too, felt the weight, the quiet pressure of judgment pressing against the rhythm of their days. One morning, Elias received a letter more direct than any before. It warned that harboring Margaret would not remain without consequence, that any attempt to shield her would risk ruin. The message was unsigned, its threats implied rather than spelled out. He understood immediately. Protection would require defiance of the law, and defiance carried risk. He imagined the consequences: fire consuming the barn, land seized, reputation shattered, his father's legacy reduced to ash. Fear pressed down on him, a tangible weight he could not lift. When Sheriff Harden finally spoke to him directly, the implication was clear. Cooperation with the law would protect Elias. Resistance would invite investigation and suspicion. He faced a moral dilemma with no easy solution: defend Margaret and risk all, or forsake her to preserve his own position. He spent nights awake, listening to the wind press against the house, weighing loyalty against prudence, safety against the pull of his growing regard for her. The weight of indecision became as pressing as the wind itself, pressing him into choices that would shape both their lives. Elias eventually approached Margaret at the postal station. He delivered distance as protection, asserting indifference, claiming practicality over sentiment. Margaret received it without resistance, her gaze hardened, calm yet unmistakably aware. She had anticipated this moment, the isolation he offered in the name of safety. Within weeks, she left town. Elias watched her wagon disappear into the horizon, dust swallowing the outline of her figure. He convinced himself he had acted for her protection and his own. The letters ceased, and Sheriff Harden's visits diminished, leaving a silence that offered no comfort, only the echo of choices made. The wind seemed to whisper that the story was far from over. The following year tested Elias in ways land and labor could not. Drought split the earth into brittle seams, then sudden storms flooded what remained, leaving fields unusable. Several farms collapsed, auction notices appearing on fences like quiet omens. Elias worked tirelessly, each sunrise bringing new labor, yet the rhythm of his effort felt hollow. The land, once a source of pride, had become a mirror, reflecting past choices and the absence of those who mattered. Autumn brought fire. In the dead of night, flames consumed half his barn before neighbors managed to contain the blaze. Timber that had stood for decades collapsed, and though some whispered of arson, no evidence emerged. Elias did not seek retribution. He accepted the destruction as consequence, both literal and symbolic. His father's legacy had always been resilient, yet the endurance of property mattered less than the endurance of the self. Winter deepened hardship. Repairs demanded funds Elias no longer possessed. He sold a portion of his land to rebuild essential structures, and later another section to settle debts. Each sale felt like a surrender, yet it preserved survival. By spring, the acreage that defined him had diminished significantly. Townspeople observed with quiet curiosity, interpreting loss as decline. Elias understood differently. Survival required adaptation. One afternoon, nearly a year after Margaret's departure, a letter arrived. The handwriting was unmistakable. Margaret informed him that she had found work in another town and that her past legal entanglements had been resolved without consequence. She asked nothing, offered no plea for assistance, only confirmation of her freedom. Elias read it repeatedly. Fear had guided him more than conviction, but now he realized that loyalty and courage demanded choice over hesitation. He began preparing to leave Nebraska, relinquishing what he had once believed essential, searching for a life redefined by experience rather than inheritance. The letter hinted at a reunion that might change everything. Elias's journey to find Margaret carried no guarantees. He traveled with limited savings and uncertain welcome. The town she described was small, orderly, and quieter than the Nebraska plains he had left. He found her at the postal counter, efficient and composed, handling each letter with the calm authority he had remembered, yet now tempered by months of careful independence. Time had refined her, adding layers of resolve to strength that had always been present. He approached cautiously, offering no excuses, only the truth of his absence and the choices he had made. He described the fire, the sold land, the losses incurred, and the recognition that fear had driven his earlier actions. Margaret listened without interruption, her expression measured and unyielding. The year apart had carved her independence deeply. She no longer relied on promises or reassurance. Her acknowledgment of his presence, quiet yet deliberate, allowed for reconciliation to begin, not in words, but in shared understanding. They rented a modest house at the town's edge, lacking the breadth of open fields, but offering safety and routine. Daily life became the medium through which trust was rebuilt. Elias worked the railway line, laboring with steady hands and quiet perseverance. Margaret continued her postal work, the rhythm of sorting letters and welcoming townspeople, providing structure. Together they established a new balance, living side by side with care rather than grand gestures. Their bond deepened through the endurance of routine, trust slowly restoring what fear had threatened to destroy. Outside, the wind carried distant reminders that challenges were never truly gone, hinting that patience and vigilance would be required yet again. 2 years had passed since Elias arrived. The town expanded slowly, new buildings rising along dusty streets, the railway line cutting steadily through the plains. Elias continued his work with the crews, his body marked by labor and his hands calloused, yet each sunrise brought satisfaction. Margaret's reputation strengthened. She was respected and trusted for her meticulous work at the postal station. Their rented home remained modest but stable, a space filled with quiet cooperation. Their lives intertwined through small daily efforts, repairing fences, tending gardens, sharing meals, and supporting neighbors. Each act built trust and reinforced the bond between them. Rumors of Sheriff Harden's manipulations still drifted occasionally through the town. Anonymous letters and whispers had once threatened to unravel everything, yet Elias and Margaret endured. Their vigilance and resilience became habitual. The past no longer dictated their days, but vigilance preserved the balance they had forged. Then a letter arrived bearing the official seal from Nebraska. Sheriff Harden had resigned following an internal investigation. His pattern of intimidation, anonymous letters, and pressure on Margaret had been exposed. Vindication came quietly, offering clarity rather than celebration. Margaret's composure remained intact, her satisfaction subtle yet unmistakable. Elias felt relief and resolve in equal measure. The revelation highlighted the lessons of endurance. Fear had dictated past choices, but loyalty and trust had prevailed over months of quiet hardship. Their bond deepened, rooted in shared experience and mutual understanding rather than mere affection. Stability was no longer measured in land or status, but in steadfastness and the deliberate choice to remain together. The town buzzed with quiet curiosity, yet for them, every day carried the potential for unforeseen trials, keeping the story far from settled. Spring brought long days and golden light across the plains. Elias and Margaret formalized their union in a simple civil ceremony, a quiet affirmation of the years they had endured and the bond forged through shared adversity. Soon afterward, Margaret gave birth to a son, whose presence added vulnerability and joy to their modest home. Parenthood demanded care, patience, and endurance, shaping Elias into a figure of gentle authority, his focus and strength now directed toward protection rather than land or reputation. Their rented house, once empty and uncertain, became a home defined by trust and shared commitment rather than acreage or wealth. They endured challenges. Illness, labor, and modest finances tested their patience and resourcefulness. Fires and storms, though distant, reminded them that life remained unpredictable. Yet their connection deepened, not through grand gestures, but through the quiet endurance of shared days. Elias no longer longed for lost land or inherited legacy. Margaret, once judged and doubted, stood beside him with steady confidence. Together they had survived rumor, fear, and loss, emerging with a commitment stronger than either had imagined. Their life became one of subtle triumphs and steady routines, a testimony to the resilience of hearts that choose loyalty over fear. As they watched the plains stretch into the horizon, holding their child and each other, the past seemed a distant echo. They had lost property and certainty, yet they had gained enduring love, trust, and a home built on shared persistence. And if you have enjoyed this journey through hardship, endurance, and lasting love, make sure to subscribe to Dust and Devotion Tales for more emotional Western stories delivered every day, where hearts find hope and resilience even in the harshest landscapes, because the next story might be even more unforgettable.